Good afternoon, everyone. Just to briefly introduce Adele Gunn, who's a member of the Yorkshire Branch. She's recently followed up her previous studies from the 1980s and 90s, and later on nutrition. And in July 2015, she started to look at and examine the new scientific studies that was coming out from that. So Adele today is sharing with us some of that information from that journey. So over to you, Adele.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Next slide. My presentation is in 4 parts. Part 1 lists where aluminium may be found. Part 2 covers 2 case studies and the therapies associated with them. Part 3 is a time strap of nutritional events and includes a mini case study and a discussion on the correct ratio of fats in a healthy diet to help mitigate the effects of Alzheimer's and other neurological diseases. And part 4 is the summary. Following the recorded lecture of Professor Chris Exley, the question I've answered is, where does the aluminium come from that finds its way up to the brain? I'm not sure how many people have actually listened to Professor Exley's presentation, but for the benefit of those that haven't, then he was talking about aluminium in the brain, and of course I'm answering the question, where does it come from? Next. It's in aluminium, may be found everywhere: architecture, airplanes, trains, automobiles, pots and pans and foil. In minute quantities, it's in the air that we breathe. Its architectural use is probably the least of the health worries. Next slide. Aluminium may be in water if it has added to the water treatment process, or in certain types of aluminium containing water softeners. Studies have described the presence of aluminium foil as either primary or secondary, and primary is where aluminium has leached into the groundwater where plants and grass are growing. In 1980s, scientists have also demonstrated that when cooking with aluminium pots and pans or wrap food in aluminium foil, the aluminium leaches into the food, and heating, salt and acidic food increases this effect. It is possible that excessive consumption of food baked with aluminium foil may carry a serious health risk. Next slide. It's in food as preservatives, colorants, anti-caking agents, baking powders, self-rising flour, and as a contaminant from packaging. Baking powder frequently are about 1/4 sodium aluminium sulfate. So if you buy anything baked and sold in a wrapper, like muffins, cakes and cookies, it likely contains aluminium. You can buy aluminium-free baking powder to avoid the neurotoxin. Baking soda is just pure bicarbonate of soda, and whether it is labelled aluminium-free or not, it should not contain aluminium. Antiperspirants contain aluminium salts that block sweat pores. Aluminium in deodorants can enter the bloodstream through skin abrasions and has been linked with breast cancer. Besides containing parabens and other chemicals, many makeup products, including foundations, lipsticks and powders, containing aluminium in nanoparticles, which is so tiny that it will cross the cell barriers and enter into organisms. It's in antacids, and heartburn drug like proton pump inhibitors have been linked to a 44% of increased risk of dementia. Buffered aspirin, that is designed to decrease gastrointestinal bleeding, is frequently buffered with aluminium hydroxide. Next slide. It is a primary component of many vaccines, where it serves as an adjuvant to artificially stimulate the immune system into action. Some recent studies have demonstrated how aluminium from vaccine can gradually migrate from its injection site in the muscle to the lymph nodes, spleen, and brain. A large emerging body of evidence has documented how aluminium in vaccine can induce chronic immune inflammation and a host of neurological and autoimmune diseases, such as Guillain-Barré syndrome and multiple sclerosis. Next slide. My first case study is a guy who's 52 years old and he lives in Leicester. I've called him John. John noticed that he was unable to remember a measurement he had taken from the time he walked from one room to the next. John went to visit his GP and was referred to a memory clinic and then a neurologist. Scans showed his brain was shrinking, and in October 2014, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. He had been identified with typical neurofibrillary tangles and senile plaques in his brain made of the beta protein. John believed that this had been caused by working for 26 years building aluminium railway cars in a workshop without extraction. The workshop was filled with aluminium dust, and they were inhaling, ingesting, and absorbing. John's research found that in 1988, in the Cornish village of Camelford, a truck driver deposited 20 tons of aluminium sulfate into household water supply instead of a reservoir tank. Eek. John read through the account of the incident and came across Professor Christopher Exley's involvement. Exley had discovered that mineral silica in the water bound to the aluminium in the brains of the salmon and removed it from the fish, which then recovered. John contacted Exley's lab for advice. Exley advised John to drink 1.5 litres of mineral water high in silica each day and exercise vigorously to sweat the aluminium out. John started his work out at least 3 times a week, and John learned about the benefits of coconut oil, turmeric, black pepper as an adjuvant on turmeric. And when John next visited his doctor, he mentioned his previous high aluminium exposure. His doctor just dismissed the idea, and when John asked about coconut oil and turmeric, he said that was useless, but John thought it was worth a try. John made himself a daily warm morning cocktail, coconut oil, turmeric powder in boiled water, stirred in cold milk and a dash of ground black pepper. I've tried this, by the way, and it really is revolting. John said that the concoction tasted nasty, but he noticed improvements within a few months of drinking mineral water high in silica, exercising and taking his morning cocktail. When he returned for a scan a few months later, the printout return with a handwritten scroll said, "What guy is this? What steroid is this guy on?" He wasn't taking any steroids, but it seemed to him that they could see the improvement. It took John a full 18 months to feel that he'd recovered. And 3 years after his Alzheimer's diagnosis, he noted that he was doing massively better. Although he says, "I'm still drinking my mineral water and my morning cocktail." John continues to get scans, but to this day, his doctor now says that he must have been misdiagnosed to begin with. My interpretation of the nutritional effects of water and cocktail: look at the labels on the mineral water bottles to see what the silica content is. There are some mineral waters that do not contain any. Next slide. As an introduction to coconut oil, I will mention mitochondria. Mitochondria convert oxygen and nutrients into adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the chemical energy of the cell that powers the cell's metabolic activities. And in studies, an early feature of Alzheimer's is a decline in the brain's ability to burn its usual fuel, glucose. Glucose is broken down from carbohydrate. Inability to burn glucose in the brain impairs brain function. Next. However, the brain has the ability to run on alternate fuel, which is normally produced from stored fat when glucose is limited, such as when people are fasting or on a very low carbohydrate diet, or when there is an impairment like Alzheimer's. The liver metabolizes fat in a process called ketosis, making ketone bodies, and ketone bodies are good for brain function. Another way to boost ketones is to consume medium chain triglycerides, fat, which the liver converts to ketones. Coconut oil is rich in the source of MCT, and it's known to be anti-inflammatory and an antioxidant, and has a long history of use in traditional medicine. Next slide. Dr. Rupiah Jila, an NHS GP, you've probably seen him on the television, mentioned that turmeric is probably one of the most extensively researched spices we have in nutritional science, and it's now commonly accepted that daily dietary inclusion can prevent bowel cancer. Rupiah and journal articles have discussed this and found, and it can also be beneficial for many other things, as detailed in slide 11. And it's an anti-cancer preventative and causes cancer cells to die via apoptosis, or as we say in Yorkshire, the cells pop their clogs. It has potential benefit to the brain as an antidepressant and neuroprotective, and in ameliorating Alzheimer's symptoms. Because turmeric is able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier and can inhibit beta amyloid from clumping together into plaques, suggesting turmeric may be a promising therapy in Alzheimer's. Turmeric is fat-soluble and so isn't easily absorbed. It's often mixed with black pepper to help increase its overall absorption or bioavailability. Turmeric is fat-soluble, and as I've said, and to enable the ingredients to be dissolved, he used boiled water, and to make it taste more palatable and provide calcium, he put milk in, but I can guarantee it didn't make any difference as far as I was concerned. The second case study, next slide, is a brain researcher's alternative approach to reversing Alzheimer's. I'm showing the slides covering other researchers' work because they each complement the other's work. They did them completely separately, and I thought it was great when I was reading them to find out that there were more people than just one person speaking the same language. Bredeson's three main types of Alzheimer's disease, you've noticed that they're type 1, primarily inflammatory, type 2 primarily deficient in key nutrients, and type 3 primarily toxic, which includes the substances like metals or biotoxins. And next slide, please. Wan Teo Ying of the University of New Mexico proposed multiple factor theory that AD develops from the interplay of 4 causes. So he was saying that all of the things that we'd listed with Bredeson, he was saying that they could all start clumping together, because that's what happens with amyloid precursor protein. Everything clumps together, and that's what makes the precursor protein toxic, because it's actually trying to repair the body in the first place. Ying's research suggests that the factors reinforce each other. And he also said, because he argued that AD isn't a disease, but it's a symptom of slow poisoning from such as viruses and bacteria. And from what I've read with other people, that would make sense, because they've also said that. Slide 14, please. Several studies have focused on APOE4 as a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's, and that's associated with great risk of Alzheimer's disease, and that's the one that happens when people get Alzheimer's when they're younger. Next slide, please. Dale Bredesen had been studying Alzheimer's disease for over 30 years. Bredesen's laboratory studies looked at neurodegenerative diseases and what causes the plaques that form, and focused on the amyloid precursor protein because it acts as a switch which sends one of two signals to neurons in the brain, one being stay healthy, and it nourishes the neurons and manages to maintain the connections between them, or suicide, that kicks off chemical events telling the cells to die, or as we would say, telling the cells to pop their clogs. And that, of course, begins the build-up of the Alzheimer's progression. Bredesen and 15 other researchers from the US and Australia found that, next slide please, the flip of the app switch from stay healthy to die could occur from a list of critical influences rather than one critical factor. They cut the list down to 36 influences, including estrogen, testosterone, thyroid hormone, insulin resistance and diabetes, lack of sun, vitamin D, specific inflammatory molecules from a fired up immune system, the presence of toxins like metals, and sedentary lifestyle, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, head trauma, gene mutations like the APOE that favour the death pathway. How the APP mechanism is tripped depends on the ratio of factors that favour health or degeneration. From this, the team concluded that the choices that are made by the individual will decide whether the anti or pro-Alzheimer's switch is turned on, and thus the protocol may be a promising therapy for Alzheimer's. Next slide, please. These influences have been found in studies from other than Bredesen, and as well as Bredesen, Wan Teo Ying, Robert Moyer and Alan Rosers, all considered that amyloid plaques are a byproduct of the disease, not its root cause. And all these wide-ranging influences are linked to tripping the same APP switch. Bredesen and his colleagues developed their RECODE treatment, as in the slide that I've got on the board at the moment. The RECODE, next slide please. The RECODE protocol overlaps and draws from integrative and functional medicine, Chinese and Ayurvedic practices and other fields. Bredesen begins by recommending, next slide please, that every person over the age of 45 gets a cognoscopy. That consists of diagnostic lab tests, imaging, and a baseline assessment of cognitive function. The results enabled a tailored therapeutic program to be developed. Now, Bredesen's personal experience, this is the case study, was about his daughter's illness. Now, his daughter hadn't got Alzheimer's, but he applied his methods to her case. Bredesen's teenage daughter had been diagnosed with early-stage lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune disease that is a leading killer of young women. Specialists suggested steroids to turn down the immune system, and they told the Bredesens, both he and his wife are doctors, that their daughter was at risk of chronic severe lupus and there was no other treatment. Bredesen was absolutely shocked that no one had asked what was causing the disease. He and his wife stepped out of the box of mainstream medicine, looked at diet changes to exclude inflammatory agents like gluten and dairy, deficiencies to be tackled and hormones to balance. Over the following months, their daughter's rashes, amenorrhea, joint pain and other symptoms disappeared. A decade later, she is still asymptomatic. Bredesen witnessed how the disease could be exacerbated or quelled by the simultaneously controlling multiple factors like diet and stress. He actually used his RICO protocol. Next slide, please. And that includes a series of things. We're going to be going through those one at a time. RICO utilizes the KetoFlex 12-3 diet. Now, that means to say that it's going to be, I'm going to give you an example of the 12-3 diet, that if you eat and finish eating at about 1900 hours, then you go to bed 3 hours later at 2200 hours, and then you fast while you're sleeping until you have breakfast at 7 o'clock. Now, the benefit of this is turning the digestive system while you're sleeping has many benefits for the brain, including inducing autophagy, in which the cells clear themselves of toxins and carry out repair work. Next slide, please. I've just checked my timer and I'm running out of time. I will let the following slides speak for themselves. You will be able to access them after this presentation. He looked at supplements, which of course were herbs. And then, next slide, he looked at herbs, and he actually looked at traditional Ayurvedic herbs, Asian medical herbs, and typical American and UK herbs as well. Next slide. The first information that I've given you here is a freebie that you can download. What it happens is that you can take the test, but if you do want the test analysing and comments made, what's going to happen is they'll charge you for it. But Bredesen had teamed up with the neuroscientist Michael Mazenich for his brain training. Next slide, please. I'm just giving you the cognoscopy one again, just so that it's in the order in which he was talking about his particular protocol. Next slide, please. The third part of my presentation leads us to how we got to where we are now with food trends and how nutrition therapy may mitigate the symptoms of disease. And I have done this in a timeline. 1961, advice from the American Heart Association, health agencies and government organizations around the world began recommending people swap from animal fats to vegetable oils, thus causing an increase in consumption of omega-6. 1970, Ansel Keys suggested that the populations that traditionally ate less meat in their diets also had lower rates of heart disease. Professor Yudkin, at the same time, argued that the real culprit was sugar, but that theory was largely ignored at the time. And in 1977, the US Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs recommended a healthy diet of 60% carbohydrate and 40% fats to reduce the risk of heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Next slide, please. Between 1909 and 1999, the estimated amount of omega-6 consumed rose in the United States by 1,000%. Just in case you're wondering why I keep quoting the United States, I've had an absolute difficulty of getting any information from the UK. This was primarily due to the consumption of soybean oil, which is high in omega-6. In the early diets, 1900s, it was approximately equal amount of omega-6 and omega-3. And when I looked at some digs in Paleolithic times, I found that it probably erred towards omega-3 rather than omega-6, but I didn't want to go back in time because I thought you'd leave the will to live. In 2004, the evidence of the 1977 diet considered weak, prompting Philip Handler to describe it as the vast nutritional experiment, because following the 60-40 diet, rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease started to rise, and today heart disease is the biggest killer in the West. Next slide, please. It is noted that up to 40% of cancers are caused by poor lifestyle and diet, and reducing the amount of refined flour and concentrated sugars and eating more fruits, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower and chlorophyll from greens like spinach could reduce the rate of breast, colorectal and prostate cancers by 70%, and that of lung cancer by as much as 50%. Next slide, please. Dame Carol Black's Working for a Healthier Tomorrow conclusions included the following. It was essential that health professionals were equipped with the appropriate skills to meet current and future needs. Healthcare professionals must adapt the advice they gave to patients to reflect the importance of remaining in or returning to wherever possible. Individuals should take personal responsibility for maintaining their health. However, we have been kept fairly in the dark with regards to nutrition, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to plug now. Next slide, please. In 2012, Philip Calder outlined the omega-3 fed the mind, was derived from plant and fish. The plant variety needed enzymic reaction to convert it into the quality of fish form. It was also said that eating too much omega-6 affects the effects of omega-3. Generally, omega-3 produces more anti-inflammatory compounds, and omega-6 produces more pro-inflammatory compounds. The third mini case study is still in my time strap, and it's 2017 as junior doctor, as he was then, Dr. Rupi Agila developed atrial fibrillation and was on the list for invasive surgery to treat. It was then that his family intervened. He addressed his lifestyle and then introduced more whole grains and vegetables into his diet, as well as practicing mindfulness whilst continuing to work cilio clock. Rupi noticed a difference these changes made, and his frequency and severity of AF episodes reduced. After a year, his heart rhythm was back to normal. In his book, he explained that natural whole foods are some of our most advanced drugs. When to eat is just as important as what to eat. A diet based around vegetables, legumes, grains, and healthy fats should give most of the nutrients that we need. In 2017, the Journal of the American Medical Association studies findings were health agencies had focused their public health alerts on fast and sugary foods as things to avoid. The researchers discovered that not eating enough fruits and vegetables had a far bigger impact on health and longevity. And studies relating to heart disease, stroke and diabetes type 2 deaths were attributed to not eating enough nuts, seeds and omega-3 fatty acids from seafood and consumption of too much salt, sodium and processed meats. Next slide, please. A paper in 2017 discussed the brain being a prime candidate to suffer significantly from mitochondrial dysfunction and possibly respond well to mitochondrial nutrients. Because maintaining mitochondrial health is an important strategy in preventing a slow decline in faculties. Next slide, please. The American Heart Association commissioned a panel to discover why these were increasing rates of diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, and other chronic diseases. The panel's findings were that medical doctors are not taught the biological complexities of food and diet, or the way it can be harnessed to reverse disease. Doctors' comprehension of the importance of nutrition is not tested, and diet does not appear on any examination papers, and health professionals are introduced to minimal information about nutritional deficiencies in biochemistry. The BBC 2018 survey surveyed UK doctors, and they discovered they knew very little about the impact of diet and lifestyle have on health. And what they are taught about nutrition is either irrelevant or inapplicable to the problems they see. Dr. Ranjan Chatterjee is one of the signatories, he's been on television recently as well, to a letter to the UK General Medical Council and Medical Schools Council, and that called for the introduction of teaching of evidence-based lifestyle inventions. Hooray! The Canadian Medical Association Journal report in 2018 found that 87% of Canadian medical students commented that their undergraduate program should include more time to nutrition. And in 2019, Lancet reported on a study that had been tracked health in 195 countries for 27 years, and concluded that 11 million deaths a year, roughly 5% of all deaths worldwide, are caused by poor diets. And poor diets are defined as low intake of all those foods I previously mentioned, and high levels of sodium and trans fat from processed fast foods, baked goods, sugary drinks, and red and processed meats. Next slide, please. ALA is often referred to as the parent omega-3 because the body can convert ALA into EPA and DHA. However, with the exception of women of reproductive age, humans are only able to convert about 5% of ALL to EPA and only just 0.5% of DHA. ALA is an essential fat, meaning that the body cannot make it, so it is essential to obtain this from diet. ALA is found mostly in fish, vegetables, especially green leafy ones, nuts and seeds such as flax and chia seeds. Next slide. Next slide, please. EPA and DHA primarily found in fatty fish, shellfish and krill, and are also present at lower levels in the fat of grass-fed ruminant animals, cattle, sheep, goats, deer, and in egg yolks, especially if the hen's feed includes fish meal, flax, or chia seeds. Next slide, please. When the cell membranes, especially the ones in the brain and central nervous system, are rich in the polyunsaturated fats, the body interprets the oxidation of these as a sign that damage is occurring and mounts a response to build the cellular damage. An omega-3 fat found in the brain messages the body. However, if the cell's membrane does not have enough DHA, that's the omega-3, the communication from the brain to the body doesn't happen, and it allows the cell to leak more toxic molecules into its environment, thus damaging neighbouring cells. Many of the studies that concluded omega-3 have no impact on disease processes, and they ignored the role that excessive omega-6 had on the individual's diet. It is not that the omega-3 does nothing, it's that it's almost impossible to make a difference between the surfeit of omega-6 they have to work against. The conversion process of omega-3 fats to DHA or EPA requires multiple steps, and each one controlled by a separate enzyme. Next slide, please. Conditions such as insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes result in a change in the activity of one or more of the key conversion enzymes, and thus either DHA or EPA may be impaired. Next slide, please. A major part of these fats that we have in our bodies are gained from those that we cook with. It's therefore useful to take a step back to look at fats and oils that we cook with. Next slide, please. Crude olive oil may be used for edible purposes without refining. Most vegetable oils contain a number of impurities. These impurities affect flavour, odour and clarity and are removed during refining, which is chemical refining rather than mechanical. The refining process is carried out over a number of stages. Next slide, please. These seeds are high in type of polyunsaturated fatty acid, omega-6, and may be degraded during processing, storage and food preparation, as heat, light and damage can affect the fats. Next slide, please. I have a list of the good and bad cooking fats. Hold on to your hats. All rendered animal fats, beef, duck, chicken lard, plus coconut and palm oils, these are all saturated fats. Olive oil, the number of double bonds determines how fragile and easily damaged a fatty acid is, and monosaturated fats like olive oil have just one double bond. Next slide, please. All vegetable oils, known as industrial seed oils, these are polyunsaturated and easily degraded. Next slide, please. And in summary, the 3 case studies have a link to nutritional therapy. Bredesen and Agila stepped out of mainstream medicine for their solutions. Western medicine is looking towards putting an emphasis on nutritional therapies. Omega-3 plays an important role in nutritional therapy. A major part of fats that we have in our bodies are gained from those that we cook with, and there are good and bad cooking fats. And finally, Chris Exley, Dale Bredesen, Robert Moyer and others have had difficulty in obtaining mainstream funding for research and have had to rely on philanthropists and public donations to continue with their research. Who gets mainstream funding is heavily influenced by either the pharmaceutical industry, the aluminium industry, and these guys have upset either or both of these industries. Thank you.
Right, thanks Adele. We've had some really good questions for you to answer, and the first one's from Amanda Dowson. Do we need to emphasise the need to have vaccinations and the risk from not having them being greater than that caused by the use of aluminium in them?
Right. The purpose of my presentation is to just point these things out. And I really think that the individuals should make their own decisions on that.
Bearing in mind the Wakefield effects, where people said not to have vaccinations is more dangerous than the actual taking of the substance.
Yes. I'm not saying don't take them. I'm saying they're there and they've got the adjuvants. Now, one of the interesting things about that, of course, is that if they're doing a mass vaccination, it would be quite useful so that if you're part of that mass vaccination, make a note of saying to the nurse, have you shaken the file up? Because they've probably got 3 or 4 shots in that. And the reason why I'm saying that is because it looks clear, a clear fluid, but of course it's got absolutely loads of compounds in it. And if you can say to the nurse, please shake it up, at least if you're the first one, you're not going to, you're not going to get any of it if you're the first one. But if you're the third one, you're going to cop for the lot of the aluminium because it's heavier than the others. I know that doesn't answer Amanda's question, but I don't really want to answer it. I really would like people to be aware of things for themselves and make their own decisions, because everybody's got their own mind.
The second question's from Sharon Treshel. What percentage of Alzheimer's prevention would you say is under our control, and to what extent do genetics play a part?
I don't know about the percentage. Professor Exley, if he'd have been here, he'd have probably been able to tell you. But what I do know is that if you've got a conglomeration of all of these things that can cause it, you're going to get it. But if you've only got 1 or 2 and you've got a really great diet, the chances are it's not going to do anything, because the omega-3 is going to keep kicking it out.
Okay, another question from Ethelda Brown. What's the ratio of coconut oil, turmeric milk required to make the cocktail that you was talking about? She works as an occupational health advisor in an aging population.
Right. Well, it's a very good question. I think that it was coconut oil was about a tablespoonful, because it's really quite grotty if you're having it in large quantities. It was a teaspoonful of turmeric. There was literally a dash, a grinding of black pepper, or you can use ready ground black pepper, but it's only a pinch of it. And so I've mentioned turmeric, coconut oil. The water he just filled up, and he put just a spot of milk in as well.
Mm. Another question from Adam Barrett. Do you believe that multivitamin tablets help or hinder the body?
It depends what quality the vitamins are. So that's all I can say about that. I don't think they hinder the body at all. Sometimes if you're having them via swallowing them, the digestive system can probably get rid of quite a lot of it before it goes down any further. But the other thing that will happen is that if it's intravenously injected into you, it goes straight into the bloodstream, and it's really quite effective. There are some doctors that do this. So I can say that if you're going to be looking at anything and you're doing it for a disease rather than just doing it for taking vitamins because you want to, then I would start finding the Agila rupees of this world and see if they can give you some more clues. Did I answer that, Tim?
Yeah. Mike Hewitt's come up with a really interesting one that affects a lot of people. Should we have amalgam tooth fillings removed?
Well, I've not had mine removed, but remember, this is my opinion and it's not IOSH's opinion. There are some people that I know that have had them removed. One of the guys that I know very well, he had his removed, and he's a nutritionist.
Very technical question from Pete Murray. During your research, have you come across the use of 810 nanometer light pulses applied via the nasal passages to the frontal area of the brain? Studies in Canada have indicated this can clear cerebral plaques.
I have, but I read the extract and I've put it on one side. Yes, I know where he's coming from, but I don't know. I've not read any more of it, and I've not looked at any other studies apart from this one abstract.
Okay, another question's just popped up from Amanda Dowson. Is there a difference between fresh and powdered turmeric from a nutritional point of view?
I'm going to say no to that because I do take powdered turmeric myself. I don't have it as a medication. I have it in a lot of food. As long as it's made from the whole plant, it's going to be fine.
Just a comment from our President-elect, James Quinn. He says he's been taking turmeric for 2 years and he believes it is helping him.
Yes, I can believe that. And what sort has he taken? Is it powder or is it is it the root that he's been taking?
He doesn't describe it, but it's powdered.
Right, right. Yes, it is. It's fine, and I can believe that it makes a difference.
So it looks like we've had the 7 questions answered. If there are any more questions to come in, please put them up, and if you will complete the webinar feedback, please, that's now on your screens. It shouldn't interfere. But has anybody else got any further questions for Adele? Hang on, I've got one come up here. Where's it gone from? I've just missed a question that was on the screen. It was more in the chat. Just let me see if I can bring it back up. Oh, Kieran Delaney's asking, what can you tell them the name of the recording that you were talking about at the beginning, because he's not been able to access it?
Oh, which recording was that?
It was, I think it's the one with Professor Exley that you referred to earlier.
Right. Well, I think that if we ask IOSH, Carrie or Ben, they'll send the they'll send the link to him.
Right. Yeah, Alistair Thompson's asking about if you could repeat the effect of silica in water.
Yes. Now this was more the thing that Professor Exley was talking about, but I can answer that to some extent, but not as eloquently as Chris Exley would. The silica actually bound round the aluminium and it helped to sweat it out. Now, in the fish, they didn't actually have to do any exercise because they swim all of the time, so they were doing the exercise. But it literally binds round the aluminium and it's either sweated out or it's weed out.
Okay, question from Mohammed Undaz. What's the best way to use coconut oil?
Well, you can actually get extremely creative with that if you so wish. You can actually fry with it, although I have been told that when I've mentioned that to people, they've said they've tried it and it makes everything taste funny. And I said, no, it makes it taste different. So you can fry it, fry with it, and you can actually mix it with coconut milk if you want to, just for in curries and all sorts of things. Does he want more information, do you think, than that?
Don't know. It's let's see what this new message is coming up, because he's just put this. Oh. Coconut oil used instead of butter in flapjacks is yum.
Yes, that's Amanda. Yes, you're right. And that's, of course, what you can do. You can put it in all sorts of baking.
Yeah, as regards the turmeric, Joe Price says it tastes a lot better. And Joe's asking, are there any nutritional elements that you would not recommend being taken as cooked food?
Oh, now that's very topical at the moment because I'd be very tempted to say because I have quite a lot of raw food normally, but because COVID-19's around, you can actually pick up some kind of nasty from raw food. So I would at the moment, and I'm not quite sure whether washing gets rid of that. So I would say at the moment I'd use, for me personally, I would use cooking. I would cook. However, salt is quite a good killer of all sorts of nasties, and they used to use that. That's the reason why the Romans called it salarium, because it was worth their salt, etc., etc. And perhaps if you put copious amounts of salt on and rinse it off, you might be in with a chance of still keeping raw food. But you'd normally have things like carrots, lettuce, and I wouldn't have raw potatoes particularly, but then I wouldn't recommend that potatoes is something that you should have loads of anyway. Have I answered that question, Tim?
Yeah. There's lots of tips coming in what you can use coconut oil for, and coconut oil in smoothies is very good, and that's recommended by Sherin.
It is. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Now then, here's another one. There's very little assistance that you can get from your GP in diagnosing early onset of dementia. I made myself very unpopular, but managed to get a GP to listen. Could you give details of the doctors that you've discussed? So I think they're referring to Professor Exley and his team.
Right. Well, I'm sure that Professor Exley, he's not a medical doctor. He's an expert on aluminium. And of course, what you've got to remember is that he's talking about aluminium in the brain, whereas Bredesen and various other people were talking about all sorts of things in the brain. Ranjan Chatterjee, he is a GP, and now he wasn't working in the hospital when I talked about the case study. Not Ranjan Chatterjee, Ajila Rupi Ajila. He's a GP. Ranjan Chatterjee is. Now, Bredesen, he's been training some people over in this country. I think there's just one person in the whole of the country that's been trained. And unfortunately, he's private, he's not NHS.
Right. There's a couple of questions coming in from Mohammed Umadraz, and I'm a bit concerned about the question. His father's 75 years old. How can he take care of him in regards to Alzheimer's? Plus, he's got other conditions. I think from my experiences with my dad, Adele, if I could answer that and say to Mohammed, you really need to go and see a GP and get some expert help, because it's such a complex disease and it's not very good being handled by non-experts.
Exactly right, Tim. I couldn't have said it better myself.
So, Mohammed, my advice to you, because my dad's suffering exactly the same, go and get expert help, because it'll wear you down. Kieran would like us to remind people about the council nominations closing at 5 o'clock on Thursday. Alistair Thompson's asking questions about Alzheimer's, coconut oil and omega-3, as well as turmeric, and she can take medication because she's had a mini stroke. She gets no treatment. If Alistair could make the question more specific, is it too late to get her on coconut oil and omega-3?
Does she have to eat?
She's able to eat by the look of it, yes.
Right. Well, you said omega-3. Well, that's from things like fish and some vegetables, if they can be converted.
Yeah.
Coconut oil is just normal food. So if she can incorporate that into normal food, that would be fine.
Yeah. There's another comment from Mike Hewitt, and again, because of my experiences, I can see where he's coming from. He's concerned about the time it takes people to get referred to a dementia specialist, and Mike, I really do. I appreciate exactly what you've gone through, because I had to go through the same with my dad, and it's heartbreaking. Yeah, we've had that. I think we've answered all the questions. I'm just trying to make sure that we have done. Alistair says it's hard to get her to eat anything, but again, I suppose that's how you put these into normal foods, and whether they can be taken as liquids, Adele.
Yeah, well, coconut oil is definitely something that's liquid.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Now, I better just mention something, Tim.
Yeah.
A lot of the studies that I found, when we were actually looking at Alzheimer's and other dementias, if they have really gone to the point where they've got worse, because remember that John, my guy, he'd been diagnosed with early dementia. Anybody that's gone longer than that, the chances are that not a lot's going to help them, but it won't make it worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember helping my dad, Adele. Anyways, it's nearly 2 o'clock, so if we've got no more questions, I think we ought to close this down. And I'll say thank you for everybody that's joined and listened, and especially thank you to Adele. Thank you, Adele.
Thank you.